who's at home right now watching this, it's really interesting trying to do a the room, one for online. It makes for an interesting bit of juggling. So hopefully we can engage both of you, both in the room and online. We're going to be talking about practical resource management, a subject dear to anybody's heart that works in project management, because you must have some problems with this, because everybody does. I remember somebody once saying to me that projects would be really, really easy if you just took the people out, aka the resources. So we know it's a big subject for a lot of people. And so what we want to do this evening is just take you through the session that we have is hopefully some practicalities, if I can get things moving on and shifting. Here we go. So, first of all, I'm Lindsay Scott, co-founder of House of PMO and also PMO Learning. House of PMO is a professional body for people that are working within PMO. But don't let that put you off if you're not in PMO right now in the audience or at home, it's fine. We obviously embrace the whole spectrum of people you find within the delivery organisation. That's what the PMO is there to do. I'm also founder of the PMO conference, now in its 10th year. So that's coming up in June this year in London. Also an author, done a lot of around stuff, careers coaching for people that are working in this space, an author speaking at conferences. With Eileen, Eileen is the other co-founder, but Eileen's more on a background of training, whereas I come from a background of recruitment and careers type stuff. From Eileen's point of view, not only a trainer, but also a lead author in some of the publications for PMOs that have really made a difference over the last decade or so. For anybody who's familiar with P3O, Eileen's the second author, and also the competency framework, which is something that the House of PMO published 4 years ago now, and also a speaker. So let's have a look at this whole resource management piece. So, for the cast your minds back, so we're here now, standing in 2025, and 10 years ago, we got interested in this subject because that's all we could hear is people talking about why is it that we struggle so much with this aspect of project management, and certainly from a PMO point of view, who are people that were responsible for trying to make things better. Ultimately, that's what the PMO is there to do, to make delivery for their organisations go smoothly, whether that be standards, processes, methods, whatever it might be. But resource management has consistently been the number one in terms of the biggest problem to try and get this working a little bit better. So back in 2015, we did a study with an organisation called ESI, which was just trying to just get into the bonnet a little bit more. So we started to understand that resource management there's a lot in there, which meant that go forward to 2017, we thought, well, actually, we really want to investigate this more, and got people around the table. We gave them some really amazing food in a really posh restaurant, and basically just got them around the table for 3 hours, trying to understand what is it that actually people are doing on the ground, and where some people may be doing some of these things better than others, which allowed us to produce a report, which is essentially still available now, but 2017, the world has moved on quite significantly, which has meant that we've revisited this. So literally, at the end of last year, we've got different people around the table to see what is going on. So what we want to share tonight is just some of the insights. This report doesn't actually get published until 3 weeks' time at our conference. So we just want to bring some of those insights today to you. So we're going to be talking about something called the circle of resource management. That's what came out of the initial thing in 2017, when we were sitting around a table trying to get our heads around what are we talking about when we talk about resource management, because there's so many different component parts, and not necessarily all in the same kind of place, and it's the same person responsible for it, which is where the PMO potentially could be the entity that might be able to pull some of these things together. So the circle of resource management essentially looked at 3 main component parts that make up good resource management. We have portfolio level, project level, and something that we're just calling resource, right? So we'll take you through that. But how do we sum in this all up? Well, somebody round the table actually said it really clearly in plain language, which is, it's just like a melting pot of stuff. It's like almost like a huge circle. Whichever way you go and try to get and solve resource management, you always end up coming back to the same place. So ultimately, the business wants to know what their resources are doing and what projects that they're working on, both now and potentially in the future. Yeah, I think we can all agree that that's one of the common things that a business is wanting to do. We, whether that be PMO or any other entity within your business, wants to be able to put some kind of tooling or system, put some process around this kind of stuff, maybe some culture, so we can actually work out what this kind of thing is going to cost us in terms of what people we need, where we want them, all of that kind of stuff. And then we want to be able to prioritize and see where we need to bring in resources and what projects we're going to run and what we'll need people to be doing both now and in the future, but also how it might impact the prioritization of the projects within our portfolios. So top and bottom of it is, there's a lot to unpick that fits across little different stages. And that's where we've got the circle, which is about projects, portfolio and resources. So that circle of resource management is what we're going to focus on tonight and give you some of the detail around some of the things that are in these three segments, okay? So, first of all, the portfolio segment. This is back in 2017 to try and understand that when we're thinking about portfolio level resource management, think that strategic, it's from the top down. Yeah, so we've got portfolio and we're trying to work out what kind of resources we need to deliver all of our projects and programs across the business, both now and potentially in the future, and depending on how far in the future we want to be looking at that. So in that portfolio segment, that's where you're getting more of the strategic stuff, where we're looking at things like prioritisation, where we're looking at tools at that kind of top level, the project levels at that top level to look across the entirety of the change delivery that's happening, being able to do forecasting, being able to do some kind of modelling around that kind of stuff. So back in 2017, these four areas were some of the first things that started to be identified as, if you want to do better in some of these things, these are the areas that we need to be looking at. Go back to this year, when we released the report, and the things that have changed in that time, so we're talking 7 years now, there are more things in there. Things have changed. We've gone through COVID. We're looking at the rise of advances in data analytics and AI. Things are moving just in those 7 years. So again, Eileen's going to go into more detail around some of these segments, but just to lay the land, at the portfolio level, these are some of the core components that both PMO and project managers and any other delivery people need to be thinking about and looking at in order to make that component of our portfolio management work. Back then in 2017, look at the project level. This is the bit that everybody who's delivering projects will understand. This is the resourcing that you need at that project level. So it's all about the things like the allocation. It's things like the tooling, again, of how people are assigned to projects. How are we getting people on board? The utilisation, big conversation about how we look at utilisation and timesheeting and all of those kind of things. Everything that people dislike about resource management comes down to the things like the timesheeting. And also looking at the way that things are planned in terms of resource planning and capacity planning. Look today at what we're looking at in terms of project level resource management. You've got quite a lot more going on here. Utilisation is still in there, but actually we're now bringing in other pieces, things like the resource conflicts that we were talking about around the table, the bun fight for resources, the pinching of resources from one project to another, all of those kind of like day-to-day things. We're also adding in there a lot more about the cross-functional coordination, so actually how projects are resourced from entirety, whether that be flexible or what we coined core and flex resource modelling, where you've got people that work both permanent and bringing in that external resource. There's also things like the resource mobility, so the internal mobility of people into projects. Quite a lot more detail now in terms of what is possible and what kind of things we can do to make that better. And then finally, the nice piece, as I like to call it, because this is the people bit. This is about making sure that we've got the right people for the job in terms of that they have that capability to do that work. There's so much stuff that's changed just in 7 years. Think about what we've been through as people working on projects. Back from 2017 to now, in terms of actually the kind of hybrid working that we do for a start and how that has impacted how people work together in teams, how people learn on the job or not. But back then, 2017, it was very much focused on trying to understand, A, do people have the capability? So we were looking at things like competency assessment, looking at the kind of training that's available and how people can train both on the job and also formal training. Looking at this problem, and a consistent problem, and still a problem today, where we don't really have clear job roles, role profiles, career paths, all of that kind of stuff. So we go back to this year, looking at how that's now starting to come together in a little bit differently, is a focus around things like the career paths, for example, is looking at how we can do better around the skills mapping, something which historically takes a lot of time and effort. It's getting easier because of the technology that's changing. So there are things that have happened in that last 7 years that has made us want to revisit this, and actually it's really started to uncover some massive changes, but also how we can deal with them. So I'm just going to hand over to Eileen, but what we're looking on screen now is that we've got those 3 parts, which are resource, portfolio and project, but it's sitting within an environment which is all around context, capability and culture. Back in 2017, we identified context and culture, those being 2 main things that really underpin and impact the way an organisation can do resource management well. You know, context being things like the kind of industry that it is, the kind of business structure that it has, culture about the kind of leadership that there is, the ways of working, those kind of things. But again, for this year, has really been able to identify, but there is another C word, and that is capability. So again, I'm going to hand over to Eileen now, who takes over and starts to take us through some of the segments in a little bit more detail.
I'm going to need your mic. Right then, evening, can't remember what we're on. It's funny, kind of, Lindsay and I we've been working on this. And it's funny when you kind of sit in an audience and listen to somebody else talk about something that you've been worked on. And it's amazing how much changes in 7 years. And not just from a kind of a COVID and a working practices perspective, but one of the things that has kind of really changed is, again, our approach to delivering projects. So I'm not going to do the kind of the agile conversation because we all know that's there. But in terms of kind of where projects sit in organisations, the number of projects that sit in organisations, and I think now, I don't know any organisation who doesn't have a concept of project and project delivery. You know, if you go back kind of the 7 years or so, there would be lots of organisations who have said, yes, we do bits and pieces, but projects have become so much of an organisation's focus. That this kind of resource management becomes even more important. Which is why I think this kind of context, capability and culture underpinning effective resource management is absolutely critical. So we can talk about kind of and I am going to go and talk about some of the things we can do, but actually addressing some of this kind of context and capability. Now, can everybody read every word of that?
You can do a little bit.
So you will get a copy of the slides. Let me just kind of pick up a couple of them in terms of things that perhaps have an impact on whether our organisation does effective resource management. So something in there in terms of just the size of the organisation. You know, it's not just the size of the organisation, it's the size of the resource pool. So a few years ago when when I did a proper job, when I was actually kind of running a PMO, we had our own little kind of resource pool that sat within the location in Birmingham. And what the organisation wanted to do was say, well, actually, we want a global resource pool across the organisation. Because now we can all work remotely, We don't necessarily need to have people who are on site sitting next to the project manager. So how do we create a resource pool and trying to manage resources globally, but the additional characteristics you need to have in your model in order to do that? Yes, in terms of kind of, we have great fun trying to kind of model that in a planning tool in terms of the times that people are working and kind of the whole concept of when's a day becomes quite an interesting piece. So that kind of just generally the size of the resources. And if you're going across different parts of the organisation, as Lindsay mentioned, just the fact that we haven't got some standard job role profiles creates a whole load of issues as well. I think the other one, which I think is, again, become more of an issue, is this context of the matrix environment. So, again, depending on your industry and the organisation you work for, at one point you are a project person or you were a business as usual person. I know when I was in IT, you were kind of one or the other. You never did both. Whereas now, whether you're an IT person or whether you work in any part of the business, the likelihood is you're going to be working on projects and business as usual. And just that trying to manage availability and not only do we have the pulls of the projects, but kind of what happens in the business. And typically time recording and charging in projects is different to kind of time recording and understanding what you do with your time in operations doesn't always match. So a real kind of difficulty there in terms of kind of that matrix environment. And that's only got more difficult as we see now more and more product management as opposed to project management in terms of how that kind of splits. I'm going to pick up on regulations because this is an interesting one and some work we've been doing in the House of PMO. When we often talk about regulations, we often kind of talk about compliance to kind of either kind of financial rules and regulations. You'll all be aware of the cyber security regulations that have come in. But what we're also finding out, organisations now are having much more regulation around environmental social responsibility that also need to be kind of built into projects and operational work. So that, again, that just adds further complexity of things that we need to measure around capability, but also in terms of kind of what's involved and how that crosses over between projects and business as usual. So the context has actually become more difficult to do with. I mean, it was hard enough to start with, but actually the context has actually kind of made it more difficult. Capability still seems to be a really interesting area that organisations still really struggle with. See, and you can think, well, how hard is it to get a series of consistent job descriptions sorted out for projects, programme managers? Hugely, yes. And we're working with a large organisation at the moment, working with them to kind of revamp their organisational-wide P3O integrated PMO model. And people struggle with the difference between a job description, which is what you get recruited into, and a role description, which is what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So they're redoing the kind of the PMO structure, and there's a gentleman there who's he's undertaking the role of a PMO manager, but he was recruited as a program manager. Now he thinks program manager sounds far more sexy than a PMO manager. Yes, and so he keeps putting his job title as a program manager, and people start saying, well, what program are you running? Well, he's not running any program. So it tends to be quite an emotive subject. You know, it's not just the kind of the challenge of kind of putting things down and getting those jobs degrees. It can be really kind of quite emotive. The other challenge we have is a bit of bun fighting, and kind of there's a word for it, which is people kind of bag sign. This is the thing I do. So who has a consistent view of the skills and capability of people in the organisation? Yeah? So HR say it is our domain. Yes, we decide on the skills and capabilities. And you go, and how much do you know about project management? Well, we send everybody on a Prince 2 course. Excellent, that's a real help, isn't it? Yes. So actually somebody needs to work with HR, yes, and finance to talk about, well, actually, what are these role descriptions? What do we actually want people to do? What skills and capabilities do we need? And it's a real balance between having it to a level of detail and then being able to use the characteristics we've recruited against when we're doing allocation to projects and programs. That whole circle, back to more circles, of actually kind of tying it together becomes really quite difficult. And unless you take a holistic view, and then you get a project manager or a program manager said, but I want some kind of specific other things as well. Well, we don't hold that information because it was never needed before. How many people update and I've said this to my children ever since they started work, every 3 months, just take a minute and work out what you've been doing in the last 3 months, because you've been doing a whole lot of stuff, little things where actually you've got a little bit more experience, you've worked with some different individuals across the organisation, you've done some tasks differently. Jot it down and record it, because it's all additional experience. When you need it for your CV or applying for another job within your organisation, you'll have forgotten all of that minutiae. So who actually, I'm just curious, you'll all have to do CPD, I'm sure, for certain memberships. Who actually consciously updates their experience on a regular basis? Oh, we've got one. We've got a couple? Yeah. But if the organisation don't have access to what you're capable of, then actually your skills are being wasted. Yes. And the organisation is saying, well, actually, we're short of people with certain skills. We'll recruit people in at additional cost. So really important that there's that kind of link to it. So, and I'm not going to, well, we'll look at it kind of, it's not there as a kind of specific thing, because we often talk about resource management as people who work in the delivery. I might say it a bit quietly. Senior management are not very competent either. Yes, when it comes to actually understanding resource management and their role in ensuring resource management is effective. And sometimes, and we found this quite a bit, that actually PMOs often spend their life working with project managers and the project teams, when actually they should be spending some of their time working with sponsors and senior executives, so they actually undertake a true sponsorship role in the project, and actually the executive are making informed decisions around investments in projects that are not just doing what is kind of right for them or their department. So the skills and capabilities and the visibility of that and the alignment of roles is still difficult and not being done. And then culture. Yes, the good old kind of, it's a really interesting word and kind of captures it. And Lindsay talked about, you know, kind of some of the politics in organisations. And we still see unhealthy cultures in organisations. We still see where the behaviours of senior management make things really difficult. But we can't, well, I'll tell you a story about kind of some senior managers that I was doing some work with. I'd done some work with an organisation, and they said, we need you to come in, Aileen, and work and develop the skills of the sponsors. They've got some projects and we want to kind of make sure that they're doing true sponsorship. So I went in, did some work with them, and everything was fine. And then I was given a phone call a couple of years later and said, Aileen, I don't think our sponsors understand programme management, so we would like you to come back in and do some work around programme management. So anyway, I went to see all of the senior people in the organisation and went round. They absolutely understood programme management. However, they only got any recognition and reward for benefits that were in their department. So of course, most of the programmes are across the organisation, but they weren't interested in the rest of the benefits. They were only doing the ones that actually kind of address those. So again, some of the things that we have to kind of put in place are not just kind of the skills and the training, but actually changing the way the organisation works. But as I said, I don't want to blame the culture on just the senior management. And I think a lot of the thing where kind of culture really displays itself is the behaviours that everybody displays doing their day-to-day role. And if you've listened to Lindsay and I speak before, you'll know that we're very keen on making sure that whatever we do, we look at some of the behaviours that people demonstrate. Now, I'm sure if there's a project manager out there, you might have had a resource that might have some free time and he thought, well, I'm not going to tell anybody because if somebody gets them, I'm not going to get them back. Yes. And you sometimes thought, actually, I know my mate Phil and I want him to work on my project because I know he's the best. So instead of giving Peter an opportunity to do some development on your project, you've insisted on having the best because that's what's good for you and your project. Yes? We know that people sometimes they work a variable amount of hours, whether that be under or over, but we record something different. So we've put a task in the plan for 3 days. We might work on it 2 days. Well, actually, we're going to put 3 days in the plan because then we can charge for 3 days and everybody thinks that our planning was perfect. Yeah? So next time, guess what happens? As soon as we've got a plan together, that task takes 3 days. For the last 4 projects, it's always taken 3 days and therefore we're going to put 3 days in again. Yes, so some of our behaviours, yes, in terms of what we do as a project manager, drive the culture. Yeah, so we can't blame that all on the senior management. Some of that is definitely us. So, we've talked about context, capability and culture. And they're the things that really underpin what we can do in some of those circles. But I do want to just spend a little bit of time on looking at what we can do and how things can make a difference. But before I start talking about those, I did want to just we're going for some audience participation. Yes? So, first question is, where do you think the greatest challenge is for your organisation? Is it at the portfolio level, which is about doing the whole capacity management piece? Is it about the project level, which is the allocation of people to projects and tasks within them? Or is it about the resourcing piece, which is around people development, career paths, understanding of skills for projects? Right then, so who's going for portfolio level? Don't know whether we can see, well, we'll get some feedback from online.
The best or the worst?
The worst, where the biggest challenges for your organisation. Who thinks it's portfolio level? Oh, interesting. Who thinks it's about allocate the project level? Couple at project level? Yes, and who thinks it's about the resource level? About the skills and the career paths? Fascinating. Do you know that they've got the most?
You get a couple of portfolios online.
Okay. And nothing on resources and projects?
Oh, one each.
One each. Okay. So interesting, isn't it? And I, if I was a betting person, I would have gone for project, but actually the resources seem to have taken it, which is, I think, is a really interesting, certainly one of the things that came out in the work that we've done this year is about that requirement of the PMO to work with the functional department, to the HR department, to actually do some more work on that. So, interesting. Right then, so what about the thing that you find most constraining in your organisation? So I'm going to be asking about context, capability or culture. Okay, so what's the most challenging? So who thinks the context or the size of the organisation, the size of the resource pool, the kind of projects, who think that causes them the most issues in their organisation? Nobody. What about capability? There's a couple. And what about the culture?
Yes, I think it's an issue.
Look at that. It's fascinating. I was wondering whether capability would have come up more because you said of the resourcing one, but it's a mixture of the ability to kind of do the skills mapping and the understanding at the heart, but actually it's the culture and the behaviours of an organisation that make that difficult as well. What do we get online?
Online you've got culture. And one is culture, senior leadership in particular.
Right. And I understand the culture senior leadership, yes. I also think it's a bit of a get out clause, because I would honestly think, and I look back to, when I've done projects, it isn't just the senior management. So let's have a look in terms of what can organisations do? And I think the problem still stands. This is the same problem we had in 2017, is I don't necessarily want all of it. Yes, I can't do all of it. But when I start looking at the Circle of Resource Management model, what you realise is that actually you need some elements of everything in order to kind of make that work. You can't take just one of the kind of the segments and do that really well and then completely ignore the other two. What we do find is that some organisations have a greater need, and therefore you're going to have to do some things at some level. So one of the things that's going to be in the paper that comes out in a couple of weeks' time is a kind of a maturity level for resource management in these kind of 5 different areas. And typically what we would say is that actually you're going to have at least a maturity level of one of each of those to get anywhere close to effective resource management, with more detail in the area that's causing your organisation most problems. So like any other method or framework or tool, looks great in the textbook. Yes, none of us work in a textbook organisation, and therefore we need to kind of understand the key issues in our organisation before we start saying, well, kind of what are the actions we need to do. But what I thought I would do is I would just come up with a couple of suggestions about what we might do in each of the different segments if we wanted to start making a difference. But the first thing is one of my favourite words that we need to think carefully about. So I live, as Lindsay mentioned, you know, we've written some textbooks and we do conference speaking, and a lot of the time, yes, particularly when I'm doing training, I live in textbook land. Textbook land is a great place, yes. Or everybody kind of does what they're meant to do. There's enough resources to deliver the project. There's enough funding. Everybody's got the right skills. The tools are perfect. Everybody kind of does their reporting on time and the brilliant dashboard, and senior management make all of the right decisions. However, very few of us live in anything that looks remotely like a textbook organisation. And one of the things that becomes really important is that we don't get caught up with theory to say, actually, we must do it exactly this way, or we must do all of these particular elements. There's a great saying, and somebody great who said it, which I can't remember who said it, but says, never let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Yes? And you don't have to take a huge step forward. I'm all for, if we're moving in the right direction and trying to improve, then actually that's what each of us should be thinking about doing. So let's have a look at kind of all of the different segments one at a time. So I've just got a couple of suggestions in each. I'm happy to have the conversation with people if they want to kind of ask some further questions. So the first bit in terms of working within the portfolio section. Now, as we said before, one of the things that we're trying to do with this portfolio segment is to align capacity and capability to what the strategy actually needs us to deliver and what those priorities are. We've got the wheel of the 4 different elements. So just 2 of the things. Now, I've taken work for the PMO, the project managers, and the project team members to do together. Yes, because you can't isolate it out to one individual kind of group. We're going to have to work collaboratively in order to make these work together. We'll deal with senior management at the end. So the first thing is that the PMO should be looking at running realistic demand, capacity and demand reviews on a regular basis. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean every week. Depending on your organisation, it could mean monthly. Now, when we say do that monthly, what we're not going to be doing is kind of switching off projects and moving people on a month-by-month basis. I mean, that would be madness. But at least what we need to be doing is that kind of regular drumbeat where we are aligning capacity and demand. And from a project management perspective, what we need is realistic and early forecasts. Now, and this is where it becomes really difficult, because you don't want to say too little, because once you put a number, yes, we know all about the kind of the framing bias, that once you've said a number, so you go, I think it's 27, and then you go and spend 10 weeks planning and you come back in 35 and they say, well, we quite like number 27. Yes, but that was just an idea. I'm now at 35. Now I can give you some evidence and some background kind of information to justify this. Yeah, but we quite like 27. You remember you said 27? So there is a real kind of danger about kind of coming with that early number, but we need a realistic view as soon as we've got it. Yeah, and that's really quite difficult to do. And one of the things that I always think is a continuous challenge is organisations tend to ask for an exact number rather than a range. And I think actually getting into kind of ranges becomes much more kind of easier where we start talking about our confidence levels and what that range might be. And going back to kind of what we talked about before, when we're starting to think about capacity and demand, part of the demand has to be, well, what skills and capabilities have we got? Yes? So there is an onus on everybody who's working on the project teams to keep their skills and capabilities up to date, because again, that will be happening, I've said quarterly, you know, you might want to do it more often than that, but it does need to be kept up to date within hopefully a system that supports that. The second thing that I wanted to have a look at is starting to understand one of the real kind of challenges is kind of across the whole dependencies about projects is, or when people are truly ready to move from one project to another project, you know, because the tasks can be finished, but there still seems to be 6 weeks of dotting I's and crossing T's. Yes, so when are people truly ready to leave the project? And I've done it myself. You move to another project and you get a phone call from the project manager. Can you just come back and do some stuff? Can somebody just have a meeting you with something? So having a true understanding, and it may be a kind of a tail off. I think we're very quick to say, well, you finish on the Friday and you start the new project on the Monday, as if there's kind of nothing, there's no kind of handover. So having a much better understanding in terms of kind of when resources are moving. The contribution of the project manager, and I know other project managers might say, well, we absolutely do this, we always shout when we've got kind of resource issues. And I think the real trick here is to do that with some kind of foresight before it actually becomes a real issue. So again, whether you kind of take a risk-based approach to resource management and start looking ahead and escalating at that point before we've got an issue. And I think some of that goes back to some of the behaviours in terms of kind of some also demonstrating some goodwill that says, actually, I've got somebody for 10 days and it's looking like I'm only going to need them for 5. So rather than allocate them to some other kind of part of the project, kind of look across the piece. And sometimes project managers, we kind of say absolutely needs to be focused on their own delivery, but they have to do it in the context, and I think we talked about this last time we were here as well, the context of the wider portfolio and kind of keeping that in mind. And from the team members, and even though the project manager is accountable for having the plan and making sure everything is correct in the plan, as a project team member, if you see some elements that could be combined or done differently, actually it's your job to kind of raise that. So don't just think, oh, that's good, I've got kind of a couple of free days where I had things, but I've finished it early, yes? Because it always kind of feels, well, we have to sometimes kind of give before we kind of get back. But those kind of changes in behaviour are what's going to change the culture in the organisation. And one of the things about culture and behaviours is you cannot always wait for somebody else to start. Yes, so actually kind of doing that and starting to say, well, actually, there's some kind of differences we can do here. We can kind of perhaps do it over here. Actually, I can do something else next week rather than this particular piece of work because of the reshift we've got. So hopefully some kind of practical things. And I, again, would just want to underpin the fact that it has to be done with collaboration. The PMO can't drive this on their own. The project managers can't drive it on. And the project team members can't drive it on their own either. So that's at the portfolio level. Second one is down at project segment. And one of the big differences between what we did in 2017 and the one we've done this year is the requirement for dynamic allocation and visibility. Now, when I implemented a project management toolkit a few years back now, we'll say, what was really fascinating to me was that the project managers were concerned that they were going to be exposed because other people could start looking at their plans. And I think there has to be an interesting kind of element of trust to say that actually we are keeping our plans up to date and they are correct. So, oh, Andy M, I'll decline access to my screen. Can I do that on here? Yes, declined them. Okay, so just a couple of things perhaps in terms within the project segment. From your PMO, the PMO should provide that kind of first level review with the project managers in terms of kind of where are we across the projects. Now again, it's very easy to do that with individual project managers and thinking about kind of what impacts their particular project. But it becomes much more powerful when actually you've got a bunch of project managers in the room together. Now at programme, it should happen automatically as part of the programme management activities, but actually even with a department or a function, it's useful to say, well, actually, how best can we use the resources that we've got available to us, and making sure that's updated. And again, from a project team member's perspective, and again, driving the right behaviours, is about making sure we're logging the actual hours that we're working, the actual time it takes to do each of those tasks, and we raise any issues promptly. Now that's really interesting. When I look at that, and I was kind of working through this, I'm thinking, that's not news, is it? Yes. That's been in every project planning textbook since the first one was ever written. And it goes back to this kind of context, culture and capability has changed. The requirement to do it now, I think, is even greater than it has been in the past. And there is a requirement for organisations to either have that through a tool or through a kind of a process where that becomes much more dynamic. So again, at the project segment, and again, this the kind of having a regular forum. We often talk about doing this at kind of portfolio level, but I also think it's kind of useful to do it in a department and certainly across a programme, is actually kind of playing out some scenarios. Yes, and again, as Lindsay mentioned, having some tools, having some AI perhaps assisted, being able to look across the piece and kind of play through some scenarios about what might happen. Should we change some timing of some of the projects? Should we change some of the resourcing? And we're going to come on to it in a minute about perhaps if we put somebody in who's not the best, but has sufficient skills, or actually we've got some float so we can actually do some development, we actually can kind of do something different and have some better outcomes across the piece. So this depends on the project managers taking not just a what's best for my project, but a collaborative approach with the other project managers and say, actually, what's the best way to share our resources? So I still want Phil doing my project. Yes, and I'd rather have Phil than Peter, but actually the project who's got Peter, what we might do is do 50-50. Yes, so they've still got the opportunity for some of the kind of those greater skills, and perhaps Phil can kind of do some coaching of Peter. So by the end of it, by the end of the next project, I actually might be comfortable with having Peter on board. Yeah. But again, what we find time and time again, this is as much about behaviours as process. And then finally, from a resource perspective, it's really nice, isn't it, to be allocated full time to a project and do nothing else. But actually, it's really good for your experience as well if you kind of are open and flexible to cover some short-term gaps for other projects and programs and get some of that experience as well. So it's about kind of creating a more dynamic resourcing environment for people to work within. Again, I don't think it's kind of groundbreaking. It's just bringing it back to our attention in terms of how can we do that in our organisation. There is a far greater need for it now than I think there's ever been. And we now have some of the tools and the capabilities in order to be able to kind of do that and manage that more effectively. So the final section is working within the resource segment. So again, this resource segment is about building capability, mobility, and interestingly, engagement. So, I obviously left the click in this one. So one of the things that the PMO needs to do is really to start looking at kind of career pathways and looking at kind of how the resourcing of future projects will be once we've kind of upskilled some of the resources. Now, I did some work with TfL, I think how many years ago now, probably about 10 years ago, and they were really ahead of the game on this. And they had 3 people in the organisation who spent their whole time looking at upskilling those who were involved in delivery, and therefore they could do their resource planning of their projects because they knew how skilled people would be in 6, 12, 18 months' time. Interestingly, they disbanded the department, you know, but I think that's a real requirement. But just recognising kind of where people are in those skills and moving them forward. As we already mentioned, from a project manager, just being open to the fact that actually having people on your project helps develop the skills, which is paying it forward, because when you need that particular skill in 3-6 months' time, there's going to be more of them who are capable in doing that. Now, yes, we still think on the most critical tasks, on the most critical projects, you do want the best in your organisation, you do want the best person available, but if you've got the opportunity to implement some kind of support and some coaching, then actually that's contributing for your own good and the other projects. And again, even though we mightn't kind of do it on a quarterly basis, and when I was an HR manager, one of the things I used to do, which kind of always kind of got people kind of a bit confused, I would write to the project manager and say, right, then you've just had 3 people on your project team. Please, can you essentially write down all of the things that we can talk about at the next kind of performance review? Yes. So it's really interesting in terms of kind of where that happens, and it kind of leads on to the next one as well, in that how many of us really talk about skills and capability in their project and the post-project review. We talk about if it's been an issue, yes. So you sent me a DBA who was rubbish, yes, and I had to get a contractor in order to be able to do the work. But we don't talk about perhaps, well, actually we had Jo on the project and they did some real good work with stakeholder engagement, and actually using her at the beginning of a project when we're starting to put the requirements together is probably going to be really useful on certain other projects. She's got a real kind of skill in that area. Yeah. We've got somebody on our project, Paul's on our project, and they've spent a lot of time developing kind of capability around risk management. Yes, and they've kind of really helped the project team in terms of being able to articulate risks and making sure we've got them all managed. Now, that's a great person who says, actually, well, why don't we put Paul in the PMO for a couple of months, because they can work and improve the processes for all of the other projects that are in the organisation. So I don't think there's enough conversation at the end of post-project reviews that say, actually, we've got a full understanding of kind of how people have developed. And feedback is sometimes difficult. It's funny, I've been at a conference over the last few days. A friend of ours introduced a trainer, a good friend of his, introduced a trainer to a new client, and there's quite a bit of work going. And then my friend said to me, he said, the client just told me they don't like the trainer. How on earth do I tell the trainer? I said, you just tell them. Yeah? As a trainer, you get kind of used to getting kind of some unfiltered feedback off all of your delegates. But you need to have those conversations. And again, addressing poor performance, addressing poor behaviours is something that needs to be done. And I think it's much easier to say, actually, we got the project done without having some of those difficult conversations. From a project team member's perspective, yes, and one of the things we talked about is actually kind of doing this development. As a project team member, I think the lots of kind of things that people say now, the only person who's looking after your career is you, yes? So you should be, at the end of the project, saying, well, I've learned this now, what I'd like is experience. I was promised some experience around this particular element and I've not had anybody. So actually start talking about what development you want. So do yourself an assessment of your competence, have words with your line manager, and then actually kind of start saying where you want it. Now, ideally, what will happen is there'll be some visibility of the projects that are coming through and the skills that are going to be required, so you can start volunteering. So it actually kind of comes round and about. So 3 different elements, 3 things that I think, 2 bits for each kind of segment that I think we need to be starting to work on. But I also think we need to start thinking about the organisational focus. Now, this is always a kind of a really difficult one, because we're almost kind of preaching to the choir here, aren't we? Yes, and one of the things that we talk about in the House of PMO is where the PMO should really now start looking at not just supporting individual projects, but having influence from a senior management perspective about saying, actually, how do we help project management across the piece? And so from an organisational focus, there's this absolute requirement for senior managers and the organisation to recognise that resource management is a strategic capability of the organisation, and they need to actively support all who are involved in that. Now, the important word for that is active. Yes, we often talk to project managers about their sponsors. We talk to PMO managers about their sponsors as well, and we say, how's your, does your PMO manager support, does your PMO sponsor support you? And they say, well, yeah, they agree with what I'm doing. And as I say to my husband, well, that's an answer to a different question. Yes, I didn't ask you whether they agreed. I said, do they actively support you? Do they stand up for you? Do they say when somebody complains, they say, no, they're doing the right thing and I want them to do it? And I think, interestingly, the resource management element around projects and projects delivery seems to have been kind of, I wouldn't say delegated down to the PMO and project managers. There's been an abdication, and there's just this assumption that it happens. And I think kind of senior management, and particularly the investment committee, if you've got such a thing in your organisation, or the portfolio delivery board, should also have an active role in making sure this happens. And so, just from a kind of a context, capability and cultural perspective, just 3 more things I wanted to add into the mix. Firstly is about clear governance. Who actually makes the decisions on who can have what? Yes? And very often it's left as a bun fight, and him who shouts loudest, and more importantly, who you know. Yes, in terms of who you can get kind of allocated on your project. So the last 12 months now, there's a new publication and certification come out about P3 governance, so project, programme and portfolio governance. And part of that should be, where does resource management sit within that? And at what level are those decisions made? Yeah, and that should tie back into the development and the allocation to projects as well. The second element, which I think came out really strongly when we did this year's work, is about aligning development with workforce planning. So in the HR department, a kind of a key role of HR is to do strategic workforce planning. What's our workforce going to look like in the next 5, 10, 15 years? And very often that tends to be done around headcount. And that doesn't always work. We actually need more understanding of capabilities, because often it's done on job titles rather than kind of detailed skills. And certainly when it comes to some of the projects, we need that to go down to kind of capability level. And then the final bit, and I wrote this slide and I thought, this is Eileen's fighting for PMO people, because actually the PMO should be seen as enablers and not enforcers. Often, yes, we are the people who get shot from both ends, because we take the message up to senior managers to say there's not available, or projects are late because there's no resources, and then we get shot by the project managers because we have to tell them there's no resources available, or we're taking a resource off them. And I thought, we can't just kind of talk about kind of stand up for the PMO. Leave us alone, we're trying our best. Yes. So I thought I'd better put another one in as well, which is from a kind of cultural perspective. It is about creating a learning culture where we actually kind of recognise the importance of feedback and development and upskilling. And I find this a really interesting juxtaposition. As you know from our introductions, we have a training company, and getting a badge these days is apparently the be all and end all. Yes, you know, the non-certification training is really difficult. And there's so much kind of training around in terms of kind of what's available on LinkedIn and from the different kind of bodies. And at one time when I first started selling project management training, it was you do your PMI or you do your APM or you do Prince 2. Now, you could do a Prince 2, you could do a project management qualification, I think, every day of the week for a year, and you'd still wouldn't have them all done. But this whole kind of concept of a learning culture and real development just seems to be completely devoid from that. Yes, and truly embedded. It's not just about kind of getting a badge and learning some new stuff. It's actually about putting it into practice and developing the skills and embedding them and using them in your day-to-day role and actually demonstrating competency rather than just a whole load of knowledge. And I think organisations have still got a long way to go to actually kind of really make that a thing. So, I think that's it.
Cool.
Is that okay? Timing-wise, I'm not doing too badly, yes?
Yeah, that's fine. If you're into any questions, perhaps you'd both like to come up to the front.
I realise there's two of those mics. Anybody got any, and I'm happy to have observations as well as, you can just say we're speaking rubbish, but I'm happy to have observations as questions.
You said culture was most important.
Yes.
I can understand that because there's different attitudes and different types of qualifications in industry. Which culture you find the most difficult to operate in as a project manager, do you think? Is it public sector, say, or private sector, or somewhere in those areas?
Oh, interesting one. I think they're both difficult, and I think whether if you're in the public sector, you think the private sector have it easy, and if you're in the private sector, I think you think it's difficult in the public sector. So I think they both have their challenges. I think the public sector perspective, in terms of kind of what I've seen, is it goes back to being able to kind of justify everything, and so it feels very kind of bureaucratic sometimes in a public sector culture. When it comes to the private sector, sometimes it's a free-for-all, which can be just as difficult. Yes, because it's not quite so process-driven. But that's a kind of a wide sweeping statement, and I suspect from a kind of a public sector and a private sector, you kind of both got examples where that doesn't. But my finding, I would say that's how I kind of find it difficult. And if you've got to wait 6 weeks to get a resource signed off, if you kind of work in the public sector, that's a nightmare. And if you work in a private sector organisation where you go and speak to your mate and kind of get them kind of allocated to you, that's just as difficult. It's just different.
Just on that, because in the public sector, what I found is it is a lot more. It's more process driven. You get a lot of PMs incompetent. PMs hiding behind process. I followed the process, but did you deliver? Nah.
Yes, it can
Whereas
be.
you wouldn't be able to get away with that in the private sector, where you are expected to just
So-
take ownership and deliver.
Well, so it was interesting. I've been away at a conference for the last few days, and one of the conversations that was had was about where the project management profession is, and the fact that everybody sees themselves as a project manager, and that kind of. So I explain project management, and England are quite happy saying, you know, kind of project management now is now a life skill. Everybody should do a bit of project management. My 10-year-old granddaughter comes home from school and says, I've got a project, Grandma. I don't want to say, right, the first thing we need to do is, have you got a vision for the project? Let's have a look at who the key stakeholders are and make sure it's worth having. Do you know, we just kind of get on and do the homework. Yes? So this concept of what a project is. My husband, bless him, yes, still every month gets his bank statement and ticks off every transaction. I get summoned every now and again, but he ticks off every transaction. He's using accountancy skills, but I wouldn't use them for £1 million merger. Yes, because he doesn't have the right skills. So this concept of a project manager can be anybody, from Eva May who's doing her homework to somebody who's doing a £1 billion construction project, and kind of almost anything in between. So it's quite interesting in terms of kind of going back to those kind of role descriptions and having a real understanding about when is a project? When are we actually kind of going to need true project management skills? And what are our expectations of project managers to actually deliver? Because we still find there's a lot of project managers who spend their time coming and say, we're going to be late. When I'm teaching project managers, say your job is to make sure you deliver to the plan, not just report on how you're doing against the plan, because they're two different things. So I think it's a really interesting in terms of what we mean by a competent project manager and how that's measured and what the feedback loop is to the project manager and what development takes place after that. So everybody's a project manager now.
There's a question in from Dawn online who is wondering what project management qualification would you recommend for someone interested in getting into project management?
Yes, of course.
There's a,
So we come and answer that and go the careers you take.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take that one. It's an interesting one. Again, it depends on what kind of project management is a good start. Generally, I see the world into two camps. We've got what we call kind of built environment type projects, so construction engineering, what we call like the heavier industry, and then you've got business and IT. So depending on where or what you're interested in terms of where you're pursuing, there tends to be that kind of hard and fast difference between them. I think the key thing is not so much which one to do, it's what the qualification will give you. And I think when Eileen alluded to Prince 2, everybody is the sheep dip, that is very much a methodology which may or may not be used in any kind of, the organisation. So what you're looking for, and I think this is the thing that most people forget, methodology, and I loved your analogy from, you've had it for years, which is the difference between, being a cook and learning to cook properly or just following a recipe. So Prince 2 would be the recipe approach, whereas learning to be a cook, going to catering college, you're looking for qualifications that actually go into the how. So some of the stuff we've talked about here tonight about how to do resource management, how to plan a project, how to write a business case. Those are all the kind of qualifications you should be seeking out. Having said that, when you do look at some of the advertisements that are around there about trying to get into project management, you'll see about the requirements that they're asking for. Good old Prince 2 will be there. And the reason why it's there is because it's kind of been there for donkey's years, at least 2 decades since I started in the kind of recruitment space. It's just a really quick and lazy way for people that are working in recruitment or indeed HR that don't even understand project management. It's just another keyword. But there are others that go with that, and that would be, as Eileen alluded to, there's things like the Prince 2, you've got BCS, and there is a project management for IT one. There's also APM and PMI. Those are the big ones. However, not every organisation falls into this camp of not understanding what project management is, and therefore they know that Prince 2 is not the right kind of thing that demonstrates true knowledge around project management. It's just a method. And now, again, if it's IT that you're interested in, now with project management, you can look at things like the kind of more agile mindset approaches. So you've got the whole Scrum thing. You've got that kind of agile at scale, so the kind of safe qualifications. But equally now, what we're seeing here with PMO is that they're supporting DevOps and product management alongside those as well. So there's a big old field, and I think when you were glibly saying about you could do a project management course for every day of the week, that's the reason why. It's because things are splintering off, because organisations are recognising that we've got specific approaches for certain types of projects and things that we want to deliver. Whereas 20 years ago, Prince 2 was like, that's your lot, there you go. So, we're maturing, but it just means that things are splintering off.
I think the other thing that's kind of developed a bit, and we haven't talked about it a lot tonight, is about this concept of competence and a competency framework, about being able to kind of demonstrate and provide evidence of what you can actually do. So there's one thing and saying, I've got my APM exam or I've got my PAI exam, but what is it can you actually demonstrate and provide evidence that you've done and you've done there's some work to be done in organisations to go back to competence assessment rather than a tick list of qualifications. And I think that's, and we recognise that from a PMO perspective, which is why we did the PMO competency framework. But there are project management competence frameworks out there. And going back to what Lindsay said, it's about what is it you're trying to achieve. And sometimes you can get that from doing a short LinkedIn course without a certificate, perhaps. But actually your real learning is when you're going to try it, when you're actually doing it on the job. Yes, and that's really is kind of, and I was an HR manager and I was forever stopping people going on training courses. That was very popular because, we have it sometimes now, well, what are you going to get out of the training course? I want my badge. Don't care. I'm happy to invest if you show me how you're going to do your job differently. And when you come back off the course, you're going to get a learning objective, which will be assessed at your annual performance review, so you can demonstrate to me that you've actually done something better because you've been done on a training course. And we seem to have kind of lost that focus when it comes to development. And I think part of it is fed by the fact there is so many certifications out there.
There's a question about line managers weren't explicitly mentioned. What about the role of line managers in a matrix environment when it comes to resource management? By the way, in the in one of the circles, I can't remember off the top of my head, it is in there in terms of kind of like the cross-functional
Yes.
kind of bits, but explicitly line
So,
management.
the reason why I didn't do it because of the audience. Yes, I'd assumed mainly we were going to have some project managers and project team members here. We do talk, and there is a couple of slides and some other talks that we've done, where actually kind of from a communication perspective, one of the issues is that we don't find that actually kind of that facilitated conversation between the PMO, the project manager and the line managers. We were talking about the doing those kind of scenarios where we have various kind of project managers there, but also in terms of having the line managers in there to understand who the best people might be. And certainly when I've introduced resource management and timesheets, which is so painful, but one of the interesting bits that we had, one of the things that was most difficult was allowing line managers a level of decision making about who did what, because they were absolutely adamant they knew their team, but they also knew the kind of the business as usual activity. So to me, it links very closely to understanding what the governance framework is around decision making of resources and making sure resource managers are not just the informed people when a decision has been made about some of their resources. They need to have a critical role in the decision making.
I just want to say something. I mean, it's okay, well, good and done. All these, certifications, your masters, double degrees here in Italy and here, and some of the qualification. The issue is how to get in there. This is the issue I've been, for some years. How do you get, project management, despite you have all the qualifications? Sometimes they look for Spanish, Italian, you have it all, or Latin, you have it all, but you cannot you go through the process of many job interviews, at the end they don't want you. So how, especially women, I'm not discriminating anyone, but I find even when I went to Brunel University, there were not many people there, many women, how, as you mentioned, culture issue, how we can overcome these obstacles, how, you are help, everybody in the community, because we need everybody to, culture issue.
Well, and some of the work that we're doing in terms of working with PMOs and saying your job is not just to help the project managers. And there's a book came out, I was talking to the author at the weekend, which is Project Management versus version 2.0, that, which is a phrase I don't like, and I did tell him that, but really says actually, project management is now so big in organisations, it's a strategic issue for the organisation. And so some of the things we've talked about in terms of kind of capability, culture and context, remember the third C, yes, is really needs to be dealt with at an organisation issue. So some of these things around kind of the skills and capability and a learning-based organisation, the PMO is now starting to work at a senior level where it can start kind of driving some of the, hopefully can start driving, well, we know it's doing it in some organisations, but hopefully that's seen to be a bigger role of the PMO than just kind of supporting individual projects and programmes, but those, what we call them in our competency framework, the enabling competencies to set the right ecosystem and environment for projects to be able to deliver well.
There's lots of chatter online about certain competency frameworks and things, so they are sharing some stuff on here. There's something called SFIA, which you could look up, which
Sophia?
is about skills stuff. There's APM has a competency framework, and as project managers, you can do that, obviously alongside the PMO competency framework as well. Yeah, just making sure that we're sharing back in the room as well, that some of these people are just having a chit chat online, which is good. Somebody has a hand up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things I think is important is people skills. You can get a manager who's technically competent, knows
Yes.
IT, knows prints inside out, but he fails to communicate with people at different levels, which the project is going to affect. So I
Yes.
think that's an important quality, and as you say, will come under competence.
Yes, no, absolutely. So I know in the PMO, so I did some work with the APM competence framework with them, but I know I was kind of worked very closely when we did the PMO competency framework. And one of the prerequisites we've said is in order to be competent has to be the behaviours. And there's a whole list of kind of soft skills that you need. Now, interestingly, I did some work with an engineering company a few years back, where we were doing an assessment of their project managers, and we used the APM competence framework, and I'll go in and do a piece of work to say, well, based on kind of your role descriptions, this is how you align or don't align. Now, there's certain kind of the technical skills, actually the requirements of their job roles were far exceeded what was in the APM competence framework. But my analysis said you don't hold any store at all on any soft skills whatsoever. Now I said, what I can do is I can redo the assessment against what you've got, but I said I would highly recommend that actually we keep the soft skills in and we put a development plan in to kind of support those soft skills, because actually it will make people more effective. So I think it's recognised, but there's still a lot of reticence with some organisations to spend time. And I know in our training company, it's much easier to sell technical training skills than soft training skills.
Or
If-
PMI like to call them power skills.
Yes, that's what the PMI call them now, power skills. So soft skills didn't get us anywhere. We'll see whether power skills gets us a little bit further forward. Right, then I'm conscious of the time. Have we got one last question?
Thank you.
Go on.
As ever. So we've gone through a whole programme of work and we've transitioned into the product world. And interesting, like we talked about the BAU hat and the project hat. And so have you got experience of organisations that have gone through that transition and that how the land lies in that, either a product management office type scenario? And is that a thing now?
So I think there's a couple of things, because what we did have an awful lot of conversations about was the impact on agile and resource management. So good old textbook agile says, and pre-COVID, yes, and lots of organisations would have a large, essentially, we'll call it a football stadium hall. And as an agile team was put together, they'd gather a few desks round and everybody would kind of work very closely together and be fully allocated to that particular piece of work for the next sprint. Now, I was always a bit cynical about whether that actually happened, and we were told, no, they have to be co-located to make it work. And then COVID happened and apparently it still works. Yes, and I was interested in terms of whether teams, that actually happened in real life, in terms of whether teams were fully allocated, whether we've really got the kind of the right mix of skills in order to do that. And I think there are organisations who try to do that, yes, but I don't think it's widespread. Because I was really interested when we were having a conversation as to kind of what impact Agile has had, because to me, you're then allocating in lumps as opposed to individuals. But it still seems to be done at an individual level rather than a kind of a group level. The product thing is a bit more interesting, because I think what happens with the product thing is just formalise something that was already happening already. So in an IT department, you have people who do lights on, fix on, fail. You do people who do new development projects, and then you've got your kind of those magic people who do boxes and wires. Yes, it's always been a kind of complete mystery to me who can do proper internal IT projects. And so you sometimes split, but actually some people kind of move across all three. So again, I'll go back to my lovely boxes and wires people. They would potentially support people who are doing other projects. So they would do a bit of their business as usual, lights on, and a bit of fix on fail, and a bit of project support. From a business as usual perspective, what you've had is people who've got an operational job, but an awful lot of those people, and the fact that we've now got more projects, will have been pulled onto a project as an SME or a potential user, yes, and so they've already had some of their time taken off their business as usual activity to work on project activity. And I would argue a lot of that has never been recognised. I did some work for an organisation a few years ago, and we were doing some resource management around certain projects. And the working assumption was each of the departments had about a 10% kind of slack of resources that they could use for projects. And I'm thinking that's an interesting concept. You speak to the line managers and go, we used to have, yes, but as the financial got a bit tighter, we don't carry that 10% slack anymore. So any project that comes along, we're really struggling to do the day job. And there's no mechanism for kind of raising that, or kind of, because we don't record time in the same way as project work. So I think the product management element is forcing us to proceduralize something that actually has always been there. Yeah. So I actually think it will help. But it's just doing that from a wider piece, and the trick is because not everybody wants to get into kind of detailed time management, and therefore I know one of the areas where we've done is where we've looked at kind of blocks of time in terms of just the split between projects and business as usual, but the product management element will drive that out into be more detailed, I suspect.
Okay, that's it.
We'll be around for a little while. I know, Lindsay, you've got to go and do a train, but we're going to have about 15 minutes before we shoot off to the train station. So I hope you found that useful. Certainly some kind of food for thought. And if you go to the House of Payment website, you'll see that report out on the 11th of June. 12th. It will be the 12th, yes, it's our conference day, so the 12th of June. So thank you very much for having us. Hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. It's been really excellent.